So the first thing we need is our basic Yiquan stance, and we do it in the traditional way. Feet together, 1 foot back, half foot back, foot out, 1 foot's width, and then turn 45 degrees. The qua, the pelvic region, the qua as it's called in Mandarin, it's a key concept, physiological concept in Chinese wushu that you don't necessarily get in other physiological systems. The idea of the pelvic region as a system in motion that you can move and change. So fingers here, sink the qua and guard up basic Yiquan stance. I'm going to need it in both ways. I'll do that again. Feet together, do it the other way, feet together, 1 foot back, half a foot back, width of a foot out, turn 45 degrees, fingers on your qua to start with to learn how to do it, and just feel that hollow there as you sink in and you assume the stance. There's no need to be pious about it. People have different size feet and different size legs and so on. It's only a rough guide. And when we do, if you go and have a look at the video we're going to do on footwork, you'll see that there's a variety and range of different kinds of ways of standing and footwork. But this is our basic start point. And then the second thing we need to know, of course, is how to hold the stick. There are different ways of holding the stick, and we're going to go through them all. But our basic way, hold the stick in your arm like this, put your hand here, the crook of your elbow pit, put your hand here, and you measure it just past the hand's width this way. And we do this very simply because we want to use this hand to support the weapon. We want to bring in this method from traditional wushu that supports a heavy weapon with the other hand, creating a stronger structure and adding power. But we don't want the butt of the stick to clash into the hand, so it's got to be far enough down, particularly in some lower movements. It's very easy just to hit your own hand with the stick, and that's why it has to be measured like that. So once you have your basic stance, and once you have your way of holding the stick, we can start beginning to put these things together. So in our basic stance, I'm left-handed. I'm going to show everything both ways. You want to be ambidextrous with your stick, as with most things in each one. Basic stance, holding the stick in the right way. And if you hold the stick out like this and then just fold it in, back up over your shoulder, just bend the arm this way. And this hand comes up here. This arm isn't stuck out like this. This arm is down. This hand is flat into the shoulder here. I'll show it the other way. Other hand. This is a defensive posture, and you may recognise it from riot videos such as riot control from all over the world. It's a very standard riot control police posture, and it's one of the geniuses of Chinese wushu. That this idea, you see it all the time in Shaolin Chuan with the gunshu, with the big stick, the idea of the stick over your shoulder this way. And indeed, when we do each one stick the other way, because we do it baseball bat style as well, we assume this exact posture from Shaolin Chuan. This way it's slightly modified. The stick is raised up a bit to help get a bit of extra power on the first strike. This hand isn't out. You'll notice the stick isn't out. So one of the things that you can learn from watching people do, videos of people doing stick sparring, is how often people will put their hand out like this. Because in stick sparring you're thinking about aggressing, whereas of course in Yiquan weapons the only thing we're interested in is self-defense in real life or death situations. We don't have to think like that. We don't have to worry about how to aggress. I'm not saying that sometimes it isn't necessary to aggress, as attack is the best form of defense, but as an overall concept we don't have our thinking skewed by that we need to score points and move in. And we also don't have gloves on our hands that protect us if they get whacked. So the reason why the stick is back like this and not in, the first reason is that whatever is out in front is a target. And you should think like this in terms of how you think about using each one stick. Someone's got a hand out in front, it's a target and you want to whack it. Also, if the stick is out in front, very often people change their grip all the time. They're not always holding it very strongly. If you can just clip the end of the stick, you can just knock it out of someone's hand. On that note, before I forget, also something you see a lot in the stick sparring videos and weapon sparring videos is when someone has a weapon knocked out of their hand, which happens all the time, they then rush for it. They rush to get it because they think, well, it's going to be empty hand versus weapon. If you do knock a stick out of someone's weapon out of someone's hand and they rush for it, then's the time to hit them again as they're going for it. You see people stumble and think, oh, what should I do here? And then very often those situations end up with them wrestling or whatever. In most cases that wouldn't have happened in reality, because if you get hit on the hand particularly and drop the weapon, you're not going to pick up another weapon with that hand. If this whacks you on your hand, full contact, you're not playing piano with that hand for the rest of your life. And that's masked in sparring because you've got big gloves on that protect you, so you can do dangerous things like keeping the stick out. For us, we keep everything tight in, we keep distance. Our ideal scenario is we don't have to engage at all, so we keep this defensive posture, but we've got this ready for the big first swing that's going to come in, however it comes in. Big first swing, it's going to come in with power because it's starting from this high position. So one of the things that we need to train is holding the stick strongly all the time and keeping hold of that, which can be quite hard when you're moving it about in sophisticated ways. Otherwise, just a tap and it can be out of your hand. But also sticks can get grabbed and you can get pulled in and it can get taken off you. There's multiple examples of that happening in chaotic situations where a riot baton has been used and they just take the baton off the police. So the next thing to consider about the basic starting posture is this hand being like this quite formal, very traditional way of holding the hand that looks unnecessarily flowery. Because again, it's one of the geniuses of Chinese wushu that's very often misunderstood. These postures where this hand does this kind of thing, particularly with weapons, and this with jianshu, bit of jianshu there. Jianshu means sword, sword play if you don't know. This isn't just about being posy or looking posy, although it has to be said that if you look like you know what you're doing, that can be a weapon in itself. But it isn't just about that. It's about knowing where this hand is all the time. So this posture, keeping this this kind of palm posture or this kind of posture, it brings your intent, your conscious intent into this other hand rather than just being on the weapon hand. So you know where it is all the time. So you have to consciously focus on where is this hand. We don't want it getting involved with the action, as it were. So each man stick doesn't really have anything like these. You sometimes see these drills, you know, when people hit and then they're in and they block and they take a weapon and they, whatever they call it, defang the snake, you know, take a weapon out of someone's hand. We don't want to do that. We don't want to start getting involved. It's too fussy. We want 3-4 moves. If we're absolutely forced to, 3-4, maximum 5 moves, and we're gone, we're out. If there's something someone's got a knife in their hand, just want to knock it out of their hand, I want to smack them on the hand and break their hand. I don't want to start messing about trying to do something too fancy. The stakes are too high. But we need to know where this hand is, and this is why we keep this posture like this. So we know where it is all the time. So now we've got our basic posture, we've got our basic way of holding the stick, we need to think about our first basic strike. It's going to be very simple, but we're going to need to learn some key philosophical concepts from each one in order to understand why we do the things the way we do. It takes a little bit of explaining, but once we get it, we don't need to explain it again and we can just move on. So our first basic strike is going to be like this. It's going to swing in and it's going to hit like this. First thing I want you to notice in that, by the way, is the footwork. It's rooted from the back foot, so this foot twists up, just like in the Yiquan punch. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same physiological, structural requirements, only the hands are doing something slightly different this way. The second thing you'll notice is that the stick hits the centre line and stops. And this is what Yao Zhongzhong called hit and stop, fundamental feature of Yiquan, but also fundamental feature of Yiquan weapons. So if you think about things like Yiquan hook, which stops at the centre line, almost no one can bring that into sparring, I have to say. That's something you have to drill to get these real Yiquan principles working in practice. But hit and stop, bring your technique to the centre line or just past and stop. So hit and stop. There's a really straightforward reason for doing this, and it's one of the wonderfully beautiful, clever things about Yiquan. And in fact, the idea is even older. It's a principle of Shaolin Chuan. And the idea is very simple, that in a life or death encounter, your chances of surviving that are not great. They're not even 50-50 in it. The longer the encounter goes on, the more chance there is that the dice will roll against you and something terrible will happen. You'll die or you'll get severely injured. So one of the things we want to do is just in every possible conceivable way we can change those odds to the best that they can possibly be. I mean, even in the best possible scenario, it might not be that you can survive it anyway, is the stark reality. But if you can do anything to just slightly change or just even up those odds in some way, you might just have a chance. The core concept, the best concept of all, is the less amount of time you are involved in that conflict, the better. Because the longer you're involved with it, the more chance there is of it going against you. So not getting involved is the best of all. Hitting a couple of times and it being over, that's next best. But an extension of this idea, which is really brilliant, it's something Yao Zhongzhun talks about, is the idea when you hit and stop, you eliminate dead time. So by dead time, we mean the kind of thing where you hit and swing past like this. So everything past the hit point now is just dead time. Nothing's happening, you're not attacking, and that's a space of time in a conflict where you add it all together, you add all that dead time up. That's time when your opponent can aggress against you. Same with a hook, you swing with your hook. This is dead time and you're vulnerable. So we want to eliminate dead time, and this is the Yiquan principle of continuous attack. It's very often misunderstood as meaning just continuously aggress. It doesn't mean that at all. It means to eliminate dead time. So you want to hit and then hit and then hit and then hit. You don't want to hit and swing dead time, hit and swing dead time, punch and swing dead time. You want to continuously change what you're doing in the conflict so that you are attacking and aggressing for the majority of that time and then out. When we apply this to stick work, it becomes a lot more clear. So even though we practice things like this and we hit at the stop point, this is the kind of thing you see in traditional wushu, where people bring a posture up to what in Yiquan we call a lock point, where the structure locks in a particular posture. And you think, well, that's rubbish. Why would you do that? You want to flow. Yeah, but when you train it, you need to train individual postures because of the structural nature of each one. It's kind of structural genius. You can train individual postures and then change this way, but we bring them to the hit and stop point. Hit and stop point, because then we're going to flow into another technique straight away by eliminating dead time. The next thing to notice with this posture is that attacks the centre line, goes a little bit past because that's the weight of the stick. Notice that the line is not straight, so we're not hitting like that. It's actually very hard to control a stick like that if you do that, particularly a heavy weapon like this. So we hit like this, comes across. There's a few different reasons why we do this. One, this structure is much more suited to controlling the power of the swing, particularly if we want to hit and stop. Having it like this is a variation of the principle of the unity of square and circular force for your proper Yiquan aficionados. Secondly, we respect the reality. We take Yao Zhongzhun's advice and we respect the reality of the fight first. We respect the reality of a chaotic situation in which anything can happen. And we know from multiple examples, particularly of riot police in action, which for me is far more useful data if you want to know what happens in a real conflict using a stick than things like stick fighting and the kind of flowery drills that you often see people doing. One of the things that we learn from that is that it's not always clean. It's not this kind of stick on stick, 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 click, 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 two-man drill that can be done very fast and look amazing, but in the end it's just a two-man drill. What we see in reality is people hit, and people can take it. It's astonishing how much punishment people can take when they're really angry. And you've got to think, if you are being aggressed upon in a life or death situation, that person is probably in a totally different mind state to you. They are, for whatever reason, enraged and trying to really, really hurt you or kill you. That's what justifies you using lethal force and picking up a weapon and using it. So we assume from the start that they are in that mental state. And you probably won't be, because you'll suddenly be, in almost all cases, even if you're lucky enough to pick up a weapon, you'll probably be startled, and you won't be in that same aggressive state until your real intention kicks in. So you hit them and they just keep coming, and the stick gets pushed back into you or pushed back in this way. So all of the techniques we do in each one short stick have the butt of the stick going past the body. Of course, there's moments where it may come near the body when we have to change into different techniques, but everything is designed to minimise this possibility of the stick just getting pushed back into your own face or your own body and pushed back. And also, another very important reason for having this angle is that it allows the stick to collapse back into you. So something else you very rarely see in short stick, and it's one of the reasons why I think each one stick has a lot to offer for short stick martial arts enthusiasts. Is that each one stick has a lot of close range stuff and things that you do when the stick is pushed in and it's very close to you, and using a stick from a much closer range than just extension of the stick. So this allows collapse back into particular positions that we're going to look at shortly. The next aspect of the mechanics of this basic strike that we need to add in, from our basic posture, when we strike in, I'll do it right-handed way, when we strike in order to hit and stop, in order to fulfill this Yiquan principle of hit and stop, we want to support this hand. So we're hitting very hard and we don't want to swing past. So this hand comes down and supports the strike. Pushes into the crook of the elbow here, and remember, we're holding the stick so that we can do that. This way, pushes in and supports. This is actually taking away power from the strike, which is different to the way we do it the other way. When we change, it's going to add power to the strike. It's taking away power from the strike because we're sacrificing that little bit of power for the tactical advantage of not swinging past into dead time. We're keeping everything live time. We stop this way. So that's all our structural mechanics of the basic strike. We're chopping down 45 degrees for this, 45 degrees, and we're not thinking about any particular target as such at the moment. One of the things that we don't want to do is start drilling in the idea that our target is always a weapon that someone else is holding, particularly a stick. So it's one of the issues with stick drills and stick-on-stick drills. You start psychologically expecting and target ranging based on hitting a stick, and we don't want to do that. Yeah, we might want to hit a stick out of someone's hand, but we also want to be able to hit the hand or hit straight into the head. You can just knock someone out with one shot, that's ideal. Just knock the weapon out of their hand and then hit them again and knock them out, that's ideal. We don't want to start thinking about subconsciously ranging ourselves against a stick. So to start with, we don't think about particular targets, we just think about the imaginary centre line of the opponent, and that's where we're striking towards at 45 degrees. 45 degrees and stop. So once you have even one basic technique, then you can start using this idea that we call the infinite curriculum, and it's the idea that within each one there's a logical structure to it. If you can do something, if you can do one thing, then you can think, well, I can do it the other way. I can do it with a step, or a step back, or a step out. And just from knowing one thing, by applying it with different kinds of footwork, you can start doing different things. So I don't want to go through every different kind of possible footwork scenario. If you've got good basic grounding in each one, you can do that yourself. The important point is that from one technique, if you just start adding it and interlinking it with other things like your footwork, you can suddenly expand it into like 50 different things that you know moving in different ways. One extension that's very much like that from this strike, from this basic strike, 45-degree strike, is simply to hit downwards. And you can see the butt of the stick comes very close to the back of the hand. You don't always necessarily get it exactly, which is why you've got to keep this hand for these kind of strikes well out of the way. This low strike follows all the same rules, just has a different target, but you can see the butt of the stick is still well past the body. So particularly, you know, people are moving in with their legs. If it catches on the leg, it's not just going to push in or into the groin. It goes past this way. And note that if it does hit this bit, this is going to go even further out this way. So there's plenty of give and flexibility in that. So now we have two basic strikes. Really, they're the same basic strike, 1 and 2, both following exactly the same principles. So now we have our first basic strike in at 45 degrees, and we even have another version of it, low, so high and low, high and low. And we've sacrificed the swing to avoid the dead time, so now we need to kind of make good on that theoretical approach, and we need to be able to strike again from this position. So it's quite easy if you swing, and I'm not saying there aren't any swings in each one's stick. We're going to look at some of the ones that do exist. If you swing, it's quite easy to swing back, this kind of posture. But if you hit and stop, it's not quite so easy to hit again in the same way. So the next key concept that we need to understand in each one is the idea of structure and how structure moves through flow into what we call a lock point. So if you think about empty hand, and you flow in a basic cross punch, and then here the whole structure locks, and this structure is a very particular kind of structure. The feet are pushing out like the roots of the tooth, pushing from the back foot, which is rooting the cross punch, and it stops here. This is the lock point. This is the point where the whole structure, just for a split second, it doesn't like tense, but the whole thing kind of firms up into a solid overall structure and hits the target point and then relaxes back into the flow. That's a key idea that we need in order to understand how each one stick works. So now that we have our basic strike, we bring it to the lock point here, which is also the impact point, and we separate those two ideas, the lock point and the impact point, for the simple reason that you can train a lock point on the air. So from flow into the lock point, where the structure just locks for a split second, not super tense, but nevertheless everything just firms up, push from the root into the strike. That's the lock point. This is the structural nature of each one, that it moves from structure to structure to structure to structure to structure, and finds flow within the movement between those structures. And that's another example of the unity of square and circular force that Wang Xiangjia talked about. So from this lock point, we've sacrificed the power that we could get from a big swing, but we've also sacrificed at this point the ease of just swinging back into another posture. We don't totally eradicate that within each one short stick. There's a few techniques that we do use that are like that we'll look at. But for the most part, we're using this hit and stop, bringing it to the lock point, which, if it hits a target, is the contact point right at the end of the stick. Well, it could be any part of the stick, in fact. Now we need to make good on this idea and think, well, where do we then move to in terms of striking again? It's easy from a swing, we can just swing back, we can just swing wildly. But from here it's not so easy, and we need an entirely different technique in order to be able to do that, and more importantly, to be able to do it with meaningful power. The technique that we use to do this is called taking the bottom out of the stick. Just like this, snatch it across like this. This is the first motion. You can practice it with a smaller stick. That's just the movement we want. 1, 2. Our overall principle in each one is we want the most power possible from the smallest possible move. That can be taken too far, and you don't need to be pious about it. The movement doesn't need to be tiny. The power has got to be enough for it to be meaningful, and there's a limit to how small a movement can be. Some people have appointed expectations of things that are basically just magic powers that don't really exist, and the videos that appear to show them aren't real. They're just not real. Here in the real world, where we're thinking about real self-defense, the reality of each one and its structural genius is far more interesting, it's far more profound, it's far more rewarding to try and capture and engage than any fantasies of magical powers. Using this technique of taking the bottom out of the stick, we're just going to change to a short 45-degree strike the other way. So from here to here. And you can look at the route and see how the route changes. 1, 2. From a back strike, back rooted, and then whole body twists on the centre line and changes to this other structure. 1, 2. It's very characteristic structural movement of each one. It's somewhere between, I always like to say, somewhere between Shaolin Chuan structure and boxing, the fluidity of boxing. Somewhere between those two, as a dialectical interaction of both, is each one, this structural way of moving that nevertheless is seeking to capture flow between structures. Again, the other way, 1, 2, 1, 2. This shift of the body is one of the ways that we're going to generate power from this very short move. Absolutely classic, just release of energy around the centre line of the body. Move the quad very fast this way, short movement. The second way that we generate power is from what the right hand is doing in this little flip like this, and as it comes in, that's where there's just a little push out with the arm like that, little chop with the arm. That's not very powerful on its own. We've got to think about the target we're hitting. If it smacks into a hand, it may be enough to knock a weapon out, but it's not going to be enough to knock someone out on its own. Or even with everything you do, it might not be. That's why we want to think in terms of usually 3-stage combinations that attack the opponent. So the next thing we do to add power, this supporting hand, which is otherwise repressing the energy of this strike, it's stopping it going too far. When we change this way, the purpose of this hand and what it's doing changes, and it pushes out and releases force this way. And we're making this structure now. 1, 2, this way, pushing out. Again, you can see the angle of the stick to the angle of the elbow. It's designed so that it doesn't hit back into the elbow. Yes, of course, it can hit back into the face, but we've got to make some compromises. 1, 2. So we try and keep it out as far as possible this way. 1, 2. 1, 2. Push this way. So as we do this movement, everything shifts into short, sharp power for that posture. A really big heavy stick like this is really, really hard to control. It requires a lot of strength, and that's why I really recommend you look at the basic training exercises that I've included as part of this video. It's really, really important to build up your strength. If I do it with a lighter stick, I can do it much, much faster. It's very hard to control a big stick like this, but the transferable skills that I get from this, I can easily transfer to a much lighter weapon. please be careful when you're doing this. This is one of the ones where it's really easy to hit the supporting hand. Particularly as you change from one to the other. If your hand's too low, you'll whack your own hand, so you have to drill this in. So the hand is always in the right place. So once you have it that way, then of course you can do it low. It's exactly the same idea. One, and then take the bottom out of the stick. The feeling is like the stick goes weightless for a second, and we'll talk about the idea of a what we call a floating hack later. The stick goes weightless for a second. It's really important that you don't loosen your grip, however, because in the chaos of the moment and the moment of the change, this is where the stick's just getting knocked out of your hand by someone's knee just going like that. They're not even going to feel it, and you're going to lose your weapon. So 1, 2. The stick has to come across your body. There's no way around it. We change to a low strike this way. So into the thigh, into the other side of the thigh, or low, whatever it's. It could be a dog, you know. It could be. I mean, I love dogs, but could be a wild animal or anything. 1, 2. So if you don't clearly understand the way that rooting works in Yiquan, by rooting we just mean the way that we push up off the floor. It doesn't have to be the floor, by the way. It could be rooting against something else, like in wrestling. It could be the way we leverage force to get the most amount of force to the contact point. The way we root in Yiquan, usually from for punches, is coming up onto the ball of the foot and push it. And what you really need to know about this is that the foot and the knee are, generally speaking, always in line with the hip point. So my hip point's the centre line of my opponent. My foot turns to point towards the centre line of the opponent, and my knee. And this makes this a much stronger structure at the lock point. So look at the way this is rooted, by the way. 1, knee pointing towards the centre line, and when I change this way, I do a much bigger turn, so it kind of breaks this rule of your knee pointing towards the target point. In this case, it just goes along with the strike, so it's in line with the actual strike itself. So it doesn't break the rule as such. It's a special case of the rule. 1, see, everything's in line with the strike, and that's to get the most amount of force possible on this otherwise quite weak technique, so that we can maintain this hit and stop, elimination of dead time way of doing each one stick.